Picture this. You're the smartest person in the room. You can see solutions that others miss. You understand complex patterns that escape everyone else. Yet you sit there in complete silence because every time you open your mouth, you watch people's eyes glaze over, their faces shut down, and that familiar wall of misunderstanding rises between you and the rest of humanity. What if I told you that this exact scenario destroyed one of history's most brilliant military strategists? A man so gifted that he won impossible battles but lost the one war that mattered most, the war against his own isolation. This is the story of Minamoto no Yoshitsune, later known as the philosopher Yoshitsune, whose intellectual gifts became a curse so devastating that it cost him everything he loved. Yet from this destruction, he discovered the secret that could transform your deepest source of pain into your greatest superpower. In the winter of 1185, Yoshitsune stood alone in a snow-covered temple courtyard, holding a letter that would change everything. He had just achieved what military historians still call impossible, defeating the mighty Taira clan through strategies so brilliant that enemy generals surrendered rather than face him in battle. He was 26 years old, at the peak of his powers, surrounded by victory. Yet as he read his brother's words declaring him an enemy of the state, he realized that his greatest strength had become his ultimate weakness. His mind, which could predict enemy movements 3 steps ahead, had failed to predict the one thing that mattered most: how his own brilliance would terrify those closest to him. The other generals feared his insights, his brother envied his innovations, and the court dismissed his ideas as too radical, too complex, too far beyond their understanding. In that moment of complete betrayal, Yoshitsune experienced what millions of deep thinkers face every day: the devastating realization that being intellectually gifted in a world that values conformity is not a blessing, but a burden that isolates you from the very people you want to help and connect with. But here's what makes this story extraordinary and directly relevant to your life right now. Instead of becoming bitter or hiding his gifts, Yoshitsune used his exile as a laboratory to study the very phenomenon that was destroying him. He spent years analyzing why intelligent, insightful people consistently find themselves on the outside looking in, why their ability to see deeper truths seems to repel rather than attract others, and most importantly, how to transform this curse into genuine connection and profound influence. What he discovered became the foundation of a philosophy so powerful that it not only saved his own life, but created a blueprint that has helped deep thinkers for centuries find their tribe, express their gifts, and create the meaningful relationships they crave without sacrificing their intellectual integrity. Tonight, I'm going to share with you Yatoshine's revolutionary method for breaking the curse of the deep thinker. But first, I need you to help me understand something crucial. Right now, pause this video and leave a comment answering this question. When was the last time you had a genuine conversation where someone truly understood, not just what you were saying, but how you think? If you can't remember, or it's been months or years, simply type "searching," because I want you to know that your search is about to end. And more importantly, your comment will help other deep thinkers realize they're not alone in this struggle. Also hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to share goes against everything society teaches about success and relationships, and YouTube might not show this to other people who desperately need to hear it. The curse begins early, usually in childhood, when you first realize that your mind works differently from those around you. Maybe you were the kid who asked too many questions, who saw connections that others missed, who worried about things that seemed obvious to you but invisible to everyone else. Yoshitsune traced his own curse back to age 12, when he was living in the Kurama temple, supposedly training to become a monk, but actually consuming every military treatise he could find. While other boys played simple games, he was developing complex strategies, studying human psychology, questioning everything the monks taught him about accepting your place in life. The monks found his questions disturbing, his ideas threatening, his very presence uncomfortable because he saw through their simple explanations to the complex realities underneath. Let me tell you exactly what happened during those formative years at Kurama, because his experience mirrors what so many deep thinkers go through in their educational and family environments. Young Yoshitsune would spend hours in the temple library, not just reading the assigned Buddhist texts, but analyzing the strategic principles hidden within ancient military classics, like the 6 secret teachings of Taigong. While his fellow novices memorized prayers and accepted doctrine without question, he was mentally dissecting the psychological tactics described in these forbidden texts. understanding how terrain could be used strategically, how weather patterns affected troop movements, how understanding human nature could predict enemy behavior. When he tried to discuss these insights with the other boys, they looked at him like he was speaking a foreign language. When he shared his observations with the senior monks, they accused him of arrogance and assigned him extra meditation as punishment for his intellectual curiosity. This pattern of intellectual isolation followed him throughout his youth and into his military career. He would present brilliant strategies that his superiors couldn't understand, predict outcomes that seemed impossible to others, solve problems through approaches so innovative that even when they worked perfectly, they made his colleagues suspicious rather than grateful. Yatoshin later wrote that he felt like he was speaking a different language, even when he used the same words as everyone else. His insights were too complex, his solutions too unconventional, his way of thinking too foreign for the people around him to grasp. And here's the deadly part of the curse that you probably recognize in your own life. The more he tried to simplify his ideas to make them acceptable, the more frustrated he became, and the more he retreated into isolation, convincing himself that he was just too advanced for his time, too intelligent for his environment, too complex for ordinary people to appreciate. The breaking point came during his most famous victory at the Battle of Ichi-no-Tani, where his unconventional strategy of attacking down a nearly impossible cliff face caught the enemy completely off guard and secured a decisive victory for his clan. Any normal general would have been celebrated as a hero, but Yoshitsune's brilliant tactics only increased the fear and resentment of his fellow commanders. They couldn't understand how he had seen the possibility that they had missed, how he had calculated risks that seemed insane to them, how he had anticipated enemy responses that appeared unpredictable to everyone else. Instead of admiration, his success earned him suspicion. Instead of gratitude, his innovation bred jealousy. Instead of recognition, his gifts created isolation. This is when he first began to understand what he would later call the deep thinker's paradox. The more effectively you use your intellectual gifts, the more you separate yourself from the very people you're trying to help and serve. But Yatoshin's breakthrough came when he realized that this story he was telling himself about being too advanced for others was actually his ego protecting him from a much more painful truth. The real problem wasn't that people couldn't understand his ideas. It was that his approach to sharing them was unconsciously designed to exclude rather than include, to prove his superiority rather than create connection. He was using his intelligence as a weapon rather than a gift, wielding his insights like a sword that cut through others' confidence rather than a light that illuminated their path. This realization shattered his identity, but also liberated him from the prison of intellectual pride that had been isolating him for years. During his years of exile, forced to survive by his wits alone while being hunted by his own brother's forces, Yatoshin had to learn how to communicate with farmers, merchants, common soldiers, people who had no formal education, but possessed deep wisdom about life, relationships, and practical problem-solving. For the first time in his life, instead of trying to impress others with his brilliance, he focused on understanding their perspectives, their challenges, their ways of thinking. He lived disguised as a traveling monk, depending on the kindness of strangers who knew nothing of his military genius, but welcomed him based on his ability to listen, to empathize, to contribute to their daily struggles in humble, practical ways. This shift from performing intelligence to practicing empathy revealed something that changed everything. Most people possess profound insights, but express them differently, through stories rather than theories, through emotions rather than logic, through practical wisdom rather than abstract concepts. The farmer who gave him shelter during a snowstorm couldn't explain military strategy, but he understood weather patterns, soil conditions, and seasonal cycles with a sophistication that amazed Yatoshin. The merchant who shared his evening meal couldn't analyze political theory, but he read human nature with an accuracy that surpassed any academic treatise. The soldier's wife who tended his wounds couldn't discuss philosophy, but she understood pain, healing, and human resilience in ways that revealed depths of wisdom Yatoshin had never encountered in scholarly texts. The problem had never been their inability to think deeply. It was his inability to recognize depth in forms other than his own intellectual style. This discovery led to what became the most transformative period of his life, as he began to study not military tactics or political strategy, but the art of human connection itself. He observed how these ordinary people created bonds, how they shared knowledge, how they supported each other through difficulties, how they found meaning and purpose in their daily lives. What he learned during this time of forced humility became the foundation for his revolutionary philosophy of intellectual connection. This discovery led to Yatoshine's development of what he called the 3 keys of deep connection, practical methods that allow intellectually gifted people to find genuine relationships without sacrificing their authentic nature. But before I share these keys with you, I need you to understand something crucial about why most intelligent people struggle with relationships. Because if you don't address the root cause of intellectual isolation, no technique or strategy will create lasting change. The curse of the deep thinker isn't really about being too smart for other people. It's about using intelligence as a defense mechanism against vulnerability, rejection, and the fundamental human need for acceptance and belonging. Most deep thinkers learned early in life that their intellectual gifts were their most valuable currency, the thing that made them special, worthy of attention, different from others. But this also taught them to measure their worth through intellectual performance rather than human connection, to seek validation through being right rather than being loved, to protect themselves from rejection by maintaining intellectual superiority. The very gifts that should connect them to others become barriers because they're unconsciously wielding intelligence as armor, rather than offering it as a gift. Until you recognize this pattern in yourself, until you're willing to risk being seen as ordinary in order to experience genuine connection, all the communication techniques in the world won't solve the deeper problem of using intellect to avoid intimacy. The first key, intellectual humility, involves recognizing that intelligence comes in many forms, and that your particular type of analytical thinking is just one valuable approach among many. When you stop measuring others' worth by their ability to match your cognitive style, and start appreciating different types of insight, you discover that the world is full of profound thinkers who express their depth through creativity, intuition, emotional intelligence, practical wisdom, and lived experience rather than abstract analysis. But intellectual humility goes deeper than just acknowledging different types of intelligence. It requires surrendering the ego investment you have in being the smartest person in the room and finding your sense of worth through contribution rather than superiority. Yatoshin learned this lesson the hard way during his exile, when his survival depended entirely on his ability to learn from people he had previously considered intellectually inferior. The mountain guide who led him safely through treacherous terrain couldn't read military maps, but his understanding of natural navigation, weather signs, and wilderness survival far exceeded anything Yatoshine had learned in strategic training. The elderly woman who hid him from his pursuers couldn't discuss political theory, but her wisdom about human nature, timing, and reading people's intentions kept him alive when his analytical abilities would have failed him. These experiences forced him to confront his unconscious arrogance and recognize that his intellectual gifts, impressive as they were, represented only a small fraction of the total spectrum of human intelligence and wisdom. The second key, emotional accessibility, means learning to share your insights through stories, emotions, and personal vulnerability, rather than through pure logic and theory. People connect with struggle, growth, uncertainty, and the human journey toward understanding. When you frame your deepest insights in terms of your own learning process, your mistakes, your questions, and your ongoing discovery rather than as final conclusions you've reached, you invite others to join you on the journey rather than feel excluded from the destination. Yatoshin found that when he shared how he developed his strategies through failure and confusion, rather than just presenting the final brilliant solution, people became fascinated rather than intimidated. This transformation in his communication style happened gradually during his exile, as he learned to survive through storytelling rather than strategic analysis. When he needed food or shelter, he couldn't offer military expertise or intellectual insights. Instead, he had to connect with people's hearts through shared human experiences. He began sharing stories about his failures rather than his victories, his confusion rather than his certainty, his fear and loneliness rather than his confidence and superiority. To his amazement, these vulnerable revelations created deeper connections than his most brilliant insights had ever achieved. People who had been intimidated by his intellectual prowess were drawn to his humanity, his willingness to admit mistakes, his openness about his own learning process. But emotional accessibility isn't just about sharing your struggles. It's about learning to receive others' emotions with the same attention and respect you give to intellectual ideas. Yatoshin discovered that most people communicate their deepest insights through emotional expressions, personal stories, and relational experiences rather than abstract concepts. When someone shares their frustration about a work situation, they're not just venting. They're often revealing profound insights about power dynamics, organizational psychology, or human motivation. When a friend talks about their relationship struggles, they're frequently demonstrating sophisticated understanding of attachment patterns, communication styles, or emotional needs. Learning to recognize and honor the intelligence embedded in emotional expression is crucial for deep thinkers who want to create genuine connection. The third key, purpose-driven communication, involves using your intellectual gifts in service of others' growth and well-being rather than for personal validation. When your motivation shifts from proving how smart you are to helping others solve their problems, discover their own insights, and feel more capable and confident, your communication naturally becomes more inclusive and effective. Your questions become invitations rather than tests. Your observations become gifts rather than judgments, and your presence becomes supportive rather than threatening. This shift happened for Yatoshin when he realized that his greatest satisfaction during exile came not from solving complex problems, but from helping ordinary people find solutions to their everyday challenges. Using his strategic thinking to help a farmer optimize his planting schedule, applying his understanding of human psychology to help a merchant improve his negotiations, utilizing his pattern recognition abilities to help a family resolve ongoing conflicts. These experiences taught him that intellectual gifts reach their highest expression when they serve practical human needs, rather than abstract theoretical pursuits. Now let me show you exactly how to apply these keys in your daily life, because understanding Yatoshin's philosophy intellectually is worthless unless you can use it to transform your relationships, your career, and your inner experience right now. The application must happen at 3 levels simultaneously. Personal relationships where you practice emotional intimacy alongside intellectual connection. Professional environments where you learn to lead through questions rather than answers. And your inner life where you transform your relationship with your own intelligence from a source of isolation to a tool of service. In your personal relationships, intellectual humility means stopping the unconscious habit of correcting others, offering unsolicited analysis, or explaining things they didn't ask you to explain. Instead, become genuinely curious about how others think, what they notice that you miss, what insights they have that come from their unique perspective and experience. When your partner shares something that happened at work, instead of immediately offering your analysis of the situation, ask questions that help them discover their own insights. What do you think was really going on there? How did that make you feel? What would you do differently next time? This approach honors their intelligence while creating the deep conversation you crave, but intellectual humility in relationships goes much deeper than communication techniques. It requires examining your unconscious expectations about intellectual compatibility in love and friendship. Many deep thinkers sabotage their relationships by demanding that their partners match their analytical abilities or share their intellectual interests as a condition for emotional intimacy. This expectation is not only unrealistic, but destructive, because it reduces complex human beings to their cognitive capabilities and ignores the many other forms of intelligence and wisdom that make relationships rich and meaningful. Some of the most profound connections Yatoshin experienced during his exile were with people who couldn't match his strategic thinking, but possessed emotional intelligence, practical wisdom, or spiritual insight that enriched his life in ways his intellectual peers never had. Emotional accessibility in relationships means sharing your intellectual insights through personal stories and emotional honesty. Instead of saying, "Research shows that most people avoid difficult conversations because of childhood attachment patterns," you might share, "I realized I've been avoiding telling you how I really feel about this situation, because somewhere inside I'm terrified that if you really know how my mind works, you'll find me too intense or complicated to love." This vulnerability creates intimacy while still honoring your analytical nature. People fall in love with humans, not with intellects. But they can fall in love with the human behind the intellect when you let them see your fears, hopes, and struggles alongside your insights. The key to emotional accessibility is learning to translate your insights into the language of personal experience and emotional truth. When you've discovered something important about human behavior, relationship dynamics, or life patterns, instead of presenting it as an objective analysis, share it as a personal revelation that connects to your own journey. I've been thinking about why I always shut down when we argue. And I think it's because my brain goes into analysis mode when I feel threatened. But that actually pushes you away, when what you need is for me to stay emotionally present with you. This approach makes your insights feel like gifts rather than lectures, and invites deeper intimacy rather than intellectual distance. In your professional life, purpose-driven communication transforms your intellectual gifts from a source of office isolation into your greatest career asset. Instead of presenting complex analyses that make colleagues feel inadequate, learn to guide group discussions through strategic questions that help the team discover insights together. Your pattern recognition abilities become incredibly valuable when you use them to help others see opportunities they might miss, rather than to prove how much smarter you are. Frame your ideas in terms of solving shared problems and achieving collective goals, rather than showcasing your individual brilliance. For example, instead of saying, "The quarterly projections are obviously flawed because they don't account for the third-order effects of the supply chain disruption," try, "I'm wondering if we might be missing some factors that could affect our projections. What do you think happens to our suppliers when the main shipping routes get disrupted? How might that ripple through to our delivery times?" This approach leads to the same insights but includes others in the discovery process, rather than excluding them from it. But professional application of Yatoshin's methods requires understanding the workplace politics of intelligence, and how intellectual gifts can be perceived as threatening rather than valuable. In most organizational environments, being too obviously smarter than others, especially those in positions of authority, can damage your career prospects regardless of how correct your insights might be. The key is learning to be brilliantly helpful, rather than obviously brilliant, to shine light on problems and solutions in ways that make others feel successful, rather than inadequate. This doesn't mean dumbing down your insights. It means presenting them in ways that enhance others' reputations and decision-making capabilities rather than highlighting their limitations. Yoshitsune mastered this during his military career before his exile, when he learned to present his strategic innovations as logical extensions of his commander's existing plans rather than revolutionary new approaches. He would phrase his suggestions as questions that led his superiors to discover the insights themselves. "General, what do you think would happen if we moved our forces to the eastern ridge before dawn? Would that give us any advantages when the enemy advances?" This approach allowed him to contribute his strategic genius while preserving his commander's dignity and authority, creating allies rather than rivals. The transformation that comes from applying Yatoshine's method goes far beyond improved relationships and career success, profound as those changes are. When you learn to use your intellectual gifts as bridges rather than barriers, when you discover that depth of connection matters more than depth of intellect, when you realize that your greatest insights come not from thinking alone, but from thinking with others, you experience what Yatoshin called the liberation of the deep thinker. The loneliness that once felt like evidence of your superiority becomes recognition of your interdependence. The insights that once isolated you become the foundation for meaningful community. The mind that once felt like a prison becomes a gift you can share with the world. This liberation manifested in Yatoshin's life as a complete transformation of his sense of purpose and identity. Instead of seeing himself as a brilliant individual struggling to find others who could appreciate his gifts, he began to understand his intellectual abilities as tools for collective wisdom, problem-solving, and human flourishing. His strategic mind, which had once isolated him from others, became the foundation for innovative approaches to conflict resolution, community building, and social harmony. His analytical abilities, which had once made him feel superior to others, became instruments for understanding and serving human needs more effectively. But here's what I need you to understand about implementing this philosophy in your own life. Because intellectual understanding without emotional commitment leads nowhere. The curse of the deep thinker doesn't disappear overnight, and your first attempts at emotional accessibility and intellectual humility will feel awkward, vulnerable, even dangerous. Your ego will resist these changes because it has learned to use intellectual superiority as protection against the pain of rejection. You'll have moments where you slip back into old patterns of excluding others or performing intelligence rather than sharing humanity. This is normal, expected, and part of the process that Yoshitsune himself struggled with for years. The resistance will be particularly strong because changing how you use your intelligence requires confronting some of your deepest fears about worth, belonging, and identity. If being smart is how you've always earned love, respect, and attention, then learning to connect through vulnerability and service can feel like losing your most valuable asset. If intellectual superiority has been your protection against feeling ordinary or unremarkable, then embracing intellectual humility can trigger profound anxiety about being rejected or ignored. If analyzing and understanding has been your way of feeling in control, then opening yourself to emotional connection and mutual learning can feel terrifyingly chaotic and unpredictable. The key is to approach this transformation with the same analytical rigor you apply to everything else in your life, but without using analysis as a way to avoid the emotional work that real change requires. Pay attention to how people respond when you ask questions instead of making statements, when you share uncertainty instead of conclusions, when you express curiosity instead of judgment. Notice how your own emotional state changes when you focus on understanding others rather than being understood by them. Track how your relationships deepen when you lead with vulnerability rather than intellect. Use your gift for pattern recognition to identify what works and what doesn't in your journey toward authentic connection. But be willing to feel your way through the process rather than trying to think your way through it. Most importantly, find other deep thinkers who are on the same journey. Yatoshin's philosophy works best in community with others who understand both the blessing and the burden of intellectual giftedness. Seek out people who appreciate depth but don't confuse intellectual complexity with human worth, who value insight but also value kindness, empathy, and emotional intelligence. These relationships become your laboratory for practicing Yatoshin's methods and your support system for the ongoing work of transforming the curse into a gift. These communities exist everywhere if you know how to recognize them and how to contribute to them in ways that create mutual value rather than intellectual competition. Look for book clubs that focus on personal growth rather than academic analysis, professional organizations that emphasize collaboration rather than individual achievement, spiritual or philosophical groups that welcome questioning and exploration rather than demanding conformity to specific beliefs. Online communities can also be valuable, but be careful to seek out spaces that encourage vulnerable sharing and mutual support, rather than intellectual debate and idea comparison. The key to finding your intellectual community is learning to recognize others who are also working to transform their gifts from sources of isolation to tools of connection. These people can often be identified by their curiosity about your perspective, rather than their need to share their own. Their willingness to admit uncertainty and continue learning, rather than their attachment to being right. Their focus on solving real problems, rather than winning abstract arguments. They may not have the same type of intelligence you do, but they will have the same commitment to using their gifts wisely, and the same recognition that true wisdom includes emotional intelligence, social awareness, and practical compassion. The truth that Yatoshin discovered in his darkest hour of exile, the truth that can transform your life starting right now, is that the very qualities that make you feel most alone in a shallow world are the qualities that can create the deepest, most meaningful connections possible. Your ability to see patterns, to think systemically, to question assumptions, to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable. These are not barriers to love and belonging. They are the foundation for relationships and communities that can change the world. But only when you learn to wield these gifts with wisdom, humility, and genuine care for others' growth and well-being. This is where Yatoshin's story becomes not just inspiring, but urgently practical for your own life. He didn't just develop a philosophy of intellectual connection. He created a systematic approach to transforming intellectual isolation into meaningful influence that anyone can learn and apply. The specific techniques he developed during his years of exile and later refined during his period as a philosopher and teacher provide a roadmap for moving from the curse of the deep thinker to what he called the blessing of the wise teacher. The blessing of the wise teacher is the ultimate transformation that awaits every deep thinker who commits to Yatoshin's path. Instead of feeling burdened by your intellectual gifts, you experience them as tools for service. Instead of being isolated by your insights, you become a gathering point for others seeking depth and meaning. Instead of struggling to find people who understand you, you become someone who helps others understand themselves more clearly. Instead of using your intelligence to prove your worth, you use it to increase the worth and wisdom of everyone around you. But this transformation requires more than understanding Yatoshin's philosophy intellectually. It demands consistent practice of his methods in real-world situations where the stakes matter and the outcomes affect real relationships. It requires the courage to risk being seen as wrong, ordinary, or vulnerable in order to create genuine human connection. It requires the wisdom to know when to share your insights and when to simply listen, when to lead through your intelligence and when to follow others' expertise, when to use your analytical abilities and when to trust your intuition or emotions. The curse of the deep thinker is real, and it has claimed too many brilliant minds who never learned how to transform their intellectual isolation into meaningful connection. But the cure is also real, and it's available to you right now through the practical application of Yatoshin's revolutionary insights. Your journey from isolation to connection, from intellectual superiority to genuine influence, from the curse of the deep thinker to the gift of the wise teacher begins with a single decision to use your mind in service of your heart and your insights in service of others' growth. The path forward is clear, but it requires commitment, practice, and community. You cannot transform the curse of the deep thinker through intellectual understanding alone. You must be willing to engage in the emotional and relational work that creates authentic change. You must be willing to risk the temporary discomfort of changing how you use your gifts in order to experience the lasting satisfaction of meaningful connection and genuine influence. If this message has reached you at the right moment, if you recognize yourself in Yatoshine's struggle and see the possibility of transformation in his solution, then subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because we're going to dive much deeper into each aspect of his philosophy in the coming weeks. Leave a comment telling me which of Yatoshine's 3 keys resonates most with your current situation. Intellectual humility, emotional accessibility, or purpose-driven communication. Your engagement not only helps the algorithm share this message with other deep thinkers who need it, but it also creates the beginning of the community that will support your transformation from the curse of isolation to the gift of authentic connection. The brilliant mind that has been your burden is about to become your greatest blessing, but only if you have the courage to use it in service of something greater than your own intellectual pride.